Welcome to Modern Learning on the Air. I'm David Kelly, your host, and today we're talking about one of the most important and most misunderstood aspects of workplace learning, designing experience that actually lead to growth. Not just check the box training, but real skill building that supports career mobility. Our guest today is Julie Dirksen, author of the acclaimed books Design for How People Learn and the follow-up Talk to the Elephant, Designing Learning for Behavior Change. Julie's always been a leader in applying behavioral science to instructional design, and she helps organizations move beyond just delivering content to designing experiences that truly make a difference. Julie, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Yeah, thank you. Any day I get to talk shop with Dave Kelly is like a good morning, so I'm
I feel the
excited.
same way about you. Thank you for that. So, obviously, we know each other very well, but for anyone who might be watching the podcast who's not familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, I still call myself an instructional designer, despite the fact that we've been playing with lots of titles in the world and things like that. I have been in doing instructional design in various ways, e-learning, live classroom, virtual, the whole gamut for I think I'm creeping up on like 30 years now. And the space that I seem to sort of fill in the industry is my first book helps a lot of people when they're just getting started. We wind up with a lot of people in training because they know a lot about their topic area and then they are asked to train other people. And so then they need help kind of understanding the learning piece of it and how do we apply that. And so that's where that's where I help people quite a bit. But then as you mentioned, I'm also really interested in the behavioral science, and that's been something I've been interested in for oh gosh, probably 15, 20 years now, which is this sort of knowing doing gap, right? We have this tool set around helping people understand things and helping people develop abilities and build skills and all of these kinds of things. But then, it's a really common refrain that people go to training and the behavior doesn't transfer back into the workplace. And there's a whole bunch of kind of complicated reasons why that comes into play. Some of it has to do with motivation, some of that has to do with competing priorities, some of it has to do with, how the learning experience is actually designed and what we can better do to sort of facilitate that behavior change when people are back in the world. So there's been this whole field kind of coalescing. And it started a lot with the behavioral economics. So the books that came out in kind of the late 2000s, like Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow or Thaler and Sunstein's Nudge. And we got really interested in, are there these strategies that we can glean from things like behavioral economics or psychology or, and some of the domains that have specifically looked at this are things like public health or finance or safety. Are there things that we can learn from those domains and use them to create training or learning experiences that are more effective at helping people actually do the thing that they're supposed to do? And I usually apply this, the way I describe it is if you've got they know what to do, but they're still not doing it scenario. So they know that they're supposed to put nice, complete notes about the sales call into the CRM, client relationship management system. And yet, they're still not doing it in any consistent way. Like that's an interesting one because telling them louder and more emphatically probably isn't going to change anything. So what else needs to change in those circumstances to actually see the behavior change that we're looking for?
You mentioned the language that we use. You call yourself an instructional designer, and that the definition of what that means kind of
Mhm.
has shifted over the years. So I want to start a little bit kind of as a place setter with the language.
Mhm.
We're exploring upskilling, which is a vanity term right now. I'd
Mhm.
argue that much of the work that you've done in your career has been in that space, but we're using that term a lot more. So when you hear that term being used these days, the focus on upskilling, what does that mean to you in the work that you do?
Yeah, and skill development is a super interesting area, and if there's a third book in me, it's going to be about the whole topic around skill development because one of the things that I've been really seeing is we kind of get stuck at the informational awareness level on a lot of skill development. And then people are sort of turned loose on the world to kind of figure it out for themselves. And lots of people do, but then also lots of people don't. Or they do, but they're maybe stuck at plateaued at a fairly low level on certain skills and those kinds of things. And so really looking at kind of what needs to happen. A lot of the skills conversation has been focused on what people are referring to as kind of like the skills-based organization. And there's the whole upskilling and reskilling, which is definitely going to be a topic as we go forward with the AI. As AI sort of takes over some of the functions, we're going to have to look at the questions of, okay, somebody used to have a job that is now largely replaceable with the AI. What else are we going to do with these people? And so that whole upskilling, reskilling conversation is going to be even more important. But the challenge is that a lot of the skills conversation is focused on the front end. Like, how do I identify skills? What's my skills ontology or my skills taxonomy? How am I matching that up to job functions? How am I, kind of identifying all of this and indexing it all and using data to drive, kind of who gets allocated where, and those kinds of questions. But not that much of the conversation is actually on, like, are there ways that we can be more effective at building those skills and developing them? And so that's the area that I'm really interested in, is what does that look like? And I think there's a big, interesting kind of question mark around the whole skill for our field of practice design. How do we design different kinds of practice in order to really build skills at a significant level? Because like I said, I think we've mostly settled for like the introductory version on most skill development. I'm going to introduce you to terms. I'm going to teach you the vocabulary. I'm going to show you an example or two, and that's going to be sufficient. And that's just not true for a lot of things. There are domains where we have more sophisticated skills practice, but they tend to be domains where the behavior is really visible. So something like music education or sports or language learning, or they tend to be areas where, the risk is so high that if this person doesn't perform well, like, people die. So doctors, pilots, driving to a certain extent. Like, one of the questions that I'll frequently ask when I'm talking about this topic is, what's harder, driving a car or being a good manager? And I occasionally get people arguing for the car, but by and large, the majority of people will tell me that being a good manager is harder than driving a car. And then I ask, okay, well, where did you get more supervised, coached practice? When you were learning to drive or when you were learning to be a manager? And people always laugh at that point because nobody gets, I mean, I think it's like 50 to 60 hours for, kids now who are going to do their driver's test, where somebody's there watching and helping them do it safely and coaching their responses and all of these kinds of things. And like, nobody gets 50 to 60 hours of coached practice before they get, buy-in from an, least proficient, if not expert manager before they get turned loose on the world. They go to a 3-day class on managerial skills and get told that they need to give feedback and delegate more. And then they get turned loose. And so they learn on the job, and sometimes they learn well, and other times,
Yeah.
there's issues. So
So to develop these skills and give people these opportunities to practice, you mentioned there's a lot of factors that go into why people aren't showing those desired behaviors, practice being one of them. But one of the things I love about the book, and I always recommend, you mentioned that your first book is good for people new to instructional design. I'd argue it's great for anybody who's in this field who hasn't just read the book, because it's a mindset. I mean, I think I read your book when I was many years in the field when I first encountered it, but it still gave me a mindset that was very helpful to it. So I'd recommend everybody.
great.
But one of the things I like about the book is you do have a model that you explore in the books around how to develop that mindset. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different things. One of the things is, just from a pure, like, upfront instructional design point of view, is really understanding what it is that you're trying to help people develop. So, for example, is it just knowledge, which it almost never is. I'll get a topic where it's 100% like a knowledge-based thing, but then that always raises the question of, why are we doing training at all? Is this something that we could send a PDF and they could read it, right? Maybe it's the new features for a new product, and we really don't need a training. We just need to inform people of it. Then, is it something procedural? And there's an interesting issue for me I distinguish between procedures and skills. So procedures are things where we have really well-defined performance, and it could be because of safety issues. So we have really well-defined performance for, like, airline pilots, for example. We have very specific set of procedures. We've said these are the things that need to happen. There's books and books and books and resources around it. And also, like, in a Starbucks, we have really well-defined procedures. We know exactly how we want them to make each drink. We've got real clear guidelines on what they're supposed to do when they're interacting with customers. And I won't say that there's never circumstances in either of those things where there's something that they have to be creative about or have to make their judgments about or something like that. But by and large, we know what good performance looks like. We've said this is what we want. Skills are another interesting one, because it's something where we, usually need to use judgment. It's usually something that you have to practice to get better at. It's usually something where there's some variability in how it's going to go. And so there's some super fascinating research. I will find her name. It's Carla something she's a researcher at Stanford in the medical stuff, but she was looking at surgeons and the way that surgeons do it. And so they had a simulated surgery where they had to repair a perforated bowel. So it's bowel with two holes that needed to be sewn up. And so what they did is they ran wires down each of the fingers of the surgeons and literally kind of created a 3D map of their movements as they were repairing the bowel. And they were also looking at some of the decisions that they made, because there's different ways to do it. One way is you close each one separately. Another way is you open it up and you have a single incision between the two things, the way that it was positioned, and then you close that one. Was there one that was better? And there were some different strategies that they used, but the big thing that they figured out when they were mapping the movements of the surgeon's fingers is that the newer surgeons tended to make bigger, faster movements. So they might pull a suture further and they might go a little bit faster, whereas the more experienced surgeons were moving more slowly and making smaller movements. And like, that's not something that we would have necessarily been able to identify, despite the fact that, surgery as a skill is extremely well kind of studied and looked at and these things like that. And so we were getting this extra insight into some of these subtleties. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to do when we're trying to figure out some of these things is, how do I take something that, you learn by feel, and what the surgeon's supposed to do is going to vary depending on how dense or soft the tissue is. There's a whole bunch of variables in there that they're responding to all of the time. And they can't necessarily talk about all of those kinds of things. And so that's a really interesting area to me, is the subtleties of all of this stuff, because one of the big things that I tend to see in sort of less effective skills transfer settings is we show you the one good example, and maybe what you need to do is you need to see 6 examples or 10 examples or 100 examples, and you need to try it in several different contexts rather than just in the one context. And we have limitations. Obviously, we have limited time, we have limited resources for these kinds of things. So the answer is, you're always probably going to get less practice than would actually be ideal. But trying to look at those kinds of things. So being able to sort of distinguish between something that's just knowledge-based, something that's procedural, where we really have well-defined performance, to something where we have this more variable performance. And so we're going to need more variable exposure or more practice over time. And then I also look at things like, is it a motivation issue? Is it they know what to do, but they still aren't doing it? And then what's kind of underlying that? Is it the incentives are misaligned? We say we want people to put complete records of the sales call in the client record after every sales call, but we're also pushing the salespeople really hard to make more calls in a day. Well, those two things fight with each other. And so which one's really the behavior that's being rewarded in that scenario? I also look at habits. Habits are interesting to me because I don't think we design very well for it. And I think there's a lot of scope there. So if I send a manager to training and say, you need to give your employees feedback, they can learn how to do it. They can even be on board. They can be like, this would be great. I should totally do this. And yet they go back and they kind of slip all into their old habits where everything's rush, rush, rush. And they just don't easily find time to stop themselves and go, oh, this is a good opportunity for me to create, to give feedback. And so when we're designing for habits, one of the things I think we should be doing is helping people figure out what's the trigger that's going to tell me now's a good time to do this, and to kind of start to grow a little bit of a muscle for recognizing when I need to catch myself, step back and go, I should give some feedback before I jump on to the next thing that we all have to do, or jump to the next meeting, or do whatever it is. And so habits are great when they're already in place, but they're difficult to form. And so helping people with some strategies that do that. Just to sum up, knowledge, procedure skills, habit, motivation. Depending on what these issues are, there's different instructional strategies we can kind of bring to bear. And the last category I sometimes talk about is like communication or environment, which goes to this idea of, are we communicating things clearly or setting expectations clearly? And maybe it's not a training problem. Maybe it's a communications problem. Or environment, like, is our environment set up well? Our hand washing compliance in healthcare went way up when we added alcohol-based hand rubs into the environment because they were faster and easier. And so that wasn't changing the people or their motivation or their attitudes. It was just changing tools that they had in the environment that could make the behavior itself easier. And so looking at kind of all of those things. So when I have a learning objective, I will ask the question of, which of these apply. Okay, it's a little bit of habit, it's some knowledge, there's a little bit of skill building, and I think there's some things we can do in the environment. And then that gives me something that I can actually work from. Because when I was in graduate school and I was learning ADDIE, they were like, here, do analysis, now do design. And it was kind of like there wasn't very much that sort of connected. If I found out this in analysis, here are design strategies should use. It was more like the design box was more like magic happens here. And so that has been what I spend a lot of my time doing, is trying to figure out, how do I create clear things that you can ask about or analyze or understand about your audience or your topic or your environment, and then map those across to design strategies that we think, either from scientific evidence or, kind of practical experience, are going to be more effective in those environments.
So as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking I think a lot of people who would hear that would probably would agree with everything that you're saying. Good portion of the people in our field would probably have some level of awareness of that's the proven practice that we should be striving for. And
Mhm.
yet still, if you looked at like of a broad stroke of the work that's done here, most of the stuff that you'd probably look at and you say, well, that's really knowledge based and experience here, not this other stuff. Why do you think that
I
is?
think that the biggest issue we face as a field is that we have a bit of a broken feedback loop. And I'm not gonna like bang the drum of Kirkpatrick level 3 or something like that. But I think we frequently lack kind of enough feedback on our efforts that can really help us make things better, right? And kind of have a good gauge of what's working and what's not working. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. I mean, we can start with SCORM and work our way down, but the amount of feedback, especially in digital environments, that we get is really just insufficient for us to judge, is this working or not? When we all were doing classroom training, there were many things that were imperfect about classroom training. I don't want to pretend this was like a great system, or that people wouldn't still do pretty tedious, awful training in classrooms. But if you were a mindful, facilitator, you could sort of see when people were getting it, and you could tell from the questions that they were asking whether the explanations were working. And you could, have people do activities and then see if they were able to kind of, do performance. And in the ideal world, we would also then like follow that back into the workplace with some kind of feedback mechanism to make sure that people were able to transfer it and that they were able to continue to do it effectively. But we get into things like e-learning environments, and we usually know that like people completed it, and maybe if they scored, a certain percentage on a quiz. Um, and that is not enough information about the efficacy of my efforts to tell me if I'm accomplishing what I want to accomplish. It just isn't. And, theoretically, we can use multiple choice quizzes for these things, but I find multiple choice quizzes are adequate for checking just that knowledge one, and a little bit procedures, because you obviously have to kind of know first, second, third for procedures. You can start to kind of scratch the surface of skills assessment with a multiple choice question if you can write really good scenario based questions that kind of put them into context. But it won't really measure most skill stuff, and it won't really like tell you if this is going to be a habit. It won't tell you, you don't get a lot of information about motivation. And so as a challenge, or the problem, one of the things that's happened in the industry is that the way that we've shown improvement is in the industry is not making better training. We keep making the same training, but we just make it faster. So, if you like walk down the expo row at any industry conference or something like that, you're going to see lots of promises of rapid, or the AI is just going to build it for you, or, the click of a button, you can transform your PowerPoint deck into an e-learning course,
Mhm.
like a lot of things, because we're viewed as a cost center. It's all about like, how can we make this faster and reduce the cost or reduce the amount of effort that we're putting into creating this? Well, that system works really well if all that you're creating is like bullet points and, multiple choice questions. I mean, I do think the most interesting aspect of the AI, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that feedback on actual performance can scale with the AI, right? So instead of answering a multiple choice question about what would you say to this problem employee, you have to formulate your own answer to this problem, of what you would really say to this problem employee. And then the AI can potentially give you feedback on it. Now, whether that's working well yet or not, I'm a little skeptical. I keep looking for examples that I think are really solid. And I keep being like, it's okay. It's not great yet. But I believe that they're coming, because we've always been able to scale content delivery. Like if I make this instructional video, it doesn't matter if I send it to 10 people or 10,000 people, basically, currently that's is not infinitely scalable, but very scalable. But if I want to give 10 people feedback on a role play performance versus giving 10,000 people feedback on a role play performance, that hasn't scaled historically in our technology. And so the fact that that's a potential thing where now I can, because of the idea of an AI feedback thing, now 10,000 people could get, feedback on their role play, their problem scenario or difficult conversation role play or something like that. That's really interesting because
Mhm.
that really does change the scope of what we can do with kind of technology-based education. But, like I said, I don't know if I think it's coming. I don't know if we're there yet.
You've mentioned all that there are lots of different factors, both internally and externally, that can affect someone's ability to perform.
Mhm.
One of those factors, broadly speaking, is the culture of an organization.
Oh, yeah.
And does it how supportive is the culture to the initiative? What role do you think L&D plays in that piece of it? I mean, I could design the greatest course that's available to someone, the greatest experience someone does, but if the manager's not supportive of it on the field, it's not going to make any change. So what's L&D's role in that space?
Yeah, and I think the thing that we should always be doing, is treating the managers who need to support the change as an audience that you're also serving, right? Because, these people are all so busy. Like, that's just the world today. Like, I don't know anybody who isn't, like, crazy busy. I literally know no one, you know? No. What can I do as a designer that is going to make the behavior as easy as possible is something I ask about my learners, but it should also be something that we're asking about managers because the behavior that they need to do is they need to reinforce the thing that the employee's been learning. And that could be about coaching, it could be about feedback, it could be about just checking in and accountability, it could be about having, follow-ups with the team. There's a lot of behaviors that are associated with them reinforcing the thing that was learned in the training. And so if I'm treating those managers as my audience as well, I'm also analyzing, okay, these are the behaviors. Do they have, there's another model that I like that I use a lot in the behavioral design, which is COMBI, which is capability, opportunity, and motivation. Are people capable of doing the thing? Do they have the opportunity to do the thing? And are they motivated to do the thing? At the top level, it's just that simple. There's a whole bunch of stuff that kind of cascades out from there, and there's a lot of it, and it's part of the behavior change wheel, which is from Susan Mickey and her team at University College London's Center for Behavior Change. But citations aside, if I'm looking at this manager and I'm saying, are they capable of reinforcing this behavior? Do they know what they need to do, right? Do they have the opportunity to reinforce this behavior? Well, maybe they don't have time. Maybe there isn't a good structure for it. Maybe it's going to get lost in the flow of work. What do we need to change about it to do that? And are they motivated to do it? And a lot of times they want to. But, one of the things I always talk about is the fact that, like, because we're all so busy, we've all got like 37 different things we're supposed to be doing with every minute of every day. And it's not enough for your thing to come in at number 38. Nobody gets to 38. Like, it's just down there, right? So if you're not in the ideally top 5 or bare minimum top 10, it's still not going to happen, right? Because nobody gets all the way through their list every day. Or I mean, maybe they do, and then I
I hate
don't
those
I don't
people.
understand those people, but good for them. And so one of the tacks to take for that is really, how do I make this as easy as possible? How do I give them tools so that they don't have to think about it, or, educate them on, the things, or help them like think about, how are you going to structure this? Are you going to do one-on-ones? Are you going to do team meetings? Where is this feedback going to happen? So really treating that as its own performance challenge to be addressed. And we talked about, I still call myself an instructional designer, but I actually really think as a field, we probably would have been better leaning into performance support
Mhm.
or performance improvement as a title for what we do, because it isn't really about the instruction. I sometimes, to be, difficult, let's say, I don't actually care what, people learn. I care what they do, right? And if there's a way to get them to do it where they don't have to learn a bunch of stuff, well, then great, let's do that. That might be changing something in the environment again, right? Or whatever. And I think people need foundational knowledge, and there's all sorts of pieces to that. But basically, this sort of fundamental question of what needs to exist. I've been doing some stuff just kind of scratching the surface with systems thinking. And there's a quote from, it's usually attributed to Edward Deming, although the attribution's a little murky, but there's a quote where it's like, every system is perfectly designed to get the result it gets. So if, for example, I'm sending people to manager training and none of it's getting applied back in the workplace, well, what's perfectly designed about that system to mean that that's happening, that nothing is getting transferred? And again, it's probably incentives, it's probably time, it's probably delayed feedback, it's probably a bunch of things that are happening in the system that are creating this result. And so then the question really becomes, how do we find the intervention points in the system where we can tweak, the cycles that are happening and kind of redirect them towards something that we feel is more productive or more useful for people.
So, and one of those factors, excuse me, that you called out a couple of times in discussion, and it kind of had the theme in just listening to you now, is around motivation. Like, how
Mhm.
are people doing? And there's a lot of factors that affect someone's motivation into it. But being practical about it, are there ways that we can design for motivation?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few pieces of it. One is the metaphor that people, I think, associate me possibly with the most, even though it's not my metaphor, it's from Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist, but is the idea of the rider and the elephant, which is, big parts of our brains are mostly concerned with like moving us around in the physical space and hearing and seeing and, controlling motion and feeling things. So emotional reactions. And all of that is what hate refers to as the elephant in our brains. And then we've got this little rider that sits kind of in front and is logical, rational thinking. It's kind of the part of our brain that we have a conversation with. It's the part of our brain that projects out into the future and considers consequences, before they act. All of these kinds of, it's sort of our little Mr. Spock brain, right? Um, and that both of these entities play a role in decision making. So when my alarm goes off and I decide whether I'm going to actually get up or hit the snooze button, the rider knows that if I get up now, I'll have time to get coffee and I won't be rushed and I'll have time to kind of check my email maybe before I, jump on a call or something. And my elephant is like, oh, warm, nice, comfortable, stay. And so that's a classic dilemma between these impulses. And we have this all the time. I really should get started on my taxes, except the new episode of that HBO show just dropped, or, whatever the dilemmas are that we're dealing with. And these are very real things. And we think that like, oh, if I just use some willpower and I can think my way out of these, then I can override it. And you can for a little bit, but everybody gets tired, everybody gets busy, all of those kinds of things. And so one of the issues with that is that we tend in a lot of training materials is only talk to the rider, only talk to the logical, rational, like future projection. And things that are compelling to the elephant are like actually getting your hands on stuff and having a visceral experience, having some kind of emotional context, having some, evidence of like actually getting to see what the consequences of certain choices are, all of those kinds of things. And so when we start to talk about things like scenario based training or, simulations or, any of these kinds of things, it's not just because we think they're nice,
Mhm.
it's because they actually hit differently and have a different impact. And there is, research to support this idea that if you experience the consequences, people's behavior changes at a different rate than if you're just told, no, that's a bad thing to do. And, not everything is worth that level of effort. Not all that, there's lots of behaviors that aren't that difficult or that crucial or whatever, but some things are. Some things are really important, you know? We really, really need you to, feel this one and really believe it and not just kind of give it lip service. And so at that point, we need to kind of invest in different sorts of learning experiences so that it's much more compelling for people.
Well, a lot of different branches that I'd love to go down if we had more time. But I do want to ask about a challenge that I've noticed. Like one of the things that's changed in the last 5, 10 years is a lot of the work that we do takes place virtually in hybrid environments and through
Yeah.
tools like we're using right now. And our approach to supporting the upskilling of people hasn't really changed as much to reflect the uniqueness of that environment. What are some of the ways that you think we should be closing that gap?
Yeah, this is such an interesting one because when we look at, this shift and, obviously COVID pushed it to pushed it way down the path a lot faster than I think anybody was anticipating. But when we moved all of this stuff into virtual environments and we created, we sort of have micro learning, you can do stuff on your phone, you can do stuff anywhere, anytime. All of these things are kind of amazing and have enabled a lot of stuff for people that maybe weren't possible before. But we also kind of created some interesting challenges about the fact that we're frequently not taking people out of their place of work when we're asking them to learn. Like that used to be something that we would always do, right? You would leave your cubicle in the corporation if you were, a corporate person, and you'd go to a different room with other people who are also learning. And we know that that social piece of, if you're in a room full of people who are already there to learn, like that helps you it helps your elephant be focused and kind of be present for the learning environment. And we've stopped doing that. And instead we, have people do this stuff at their desk, and they jump on Zoom or whatever, but maybe they keep their camera off because, the truth is they're going to multitask and look at their emails
Mm-hmm.
while they're doing these things. Or it's a nice little super quickie module that they can use on their phone and do anywhere, except we didn't really carve out time in their day for that. It's supposed to be the thing that you're just kind of finding time for in between the things, right? Well, I know lots of people who, can barely find time for like bathroom breaks in between the things, So like if they don't have, if they have back-to-back Zoom meetings, when are they sneaking in this like 5-minute e-learning on whatever the topic is? And as you're sitting here at your desk, right, like in our ideal world, we're in this nice bubble of being really focused on the learning experience. But in actuality, we've got little, your emails are popping up and your phone's dinging and your things are going on, and you can see the open tabs that you didn't close before you jumped into the Zoom call because you kind of got interrupted mid thing, and you're still sort of thinking about those a little bit. And you know that you've got like, oh, and you've seen that 37 emails have popped in since you've been on this, this webinar or whatever it is. And like, that's, driving up your anxiety levels. And so we no longer have environments where we're kind of creating this sort of like attention bubble for people. And I do think that that is something that we have to reconcile in these, in these like attention loaded worlds, is how are we carving out, like time for people to just be in learning mode. And I don't know what's going to happen with the VR thing. We've had it as an option for probably 20 years now, and it still feels like it's almost
Yeah.
a big thing, and it's almost a big thing. I'm hoping that actually the AI will bring the authoring cost for VR environments way
Mm-hmm.
down, and that is potentially going to maybe be a shift. Because one of the things about those is it does create that attention bubble, right? Like it does actually filter out all the outside noise, and you're in an environment. And so I think that that's still a really interesting thing, because as we look at this, as we move more and more of our lives into online spaces, we need those online spaces to evolve to allow for the complexity of real interaction. I mean, I know you dealt very much with the issue of how do we move a conference online in like a minute. And one of the things, those, like, they were trying to build those, there's Hopin, and there was a few others where it was these online conference environments. And I remember that one of the things that would happen is if you went into the expo, you clicked on a vendor, you wound up like face to face with a salesperson, which was not fun, I think, for either party. Because in the physical space, you like can walk down the middle of the aisle, or you can stop and kind of be outside the booth but kind of check out what they're doing. And then if you're really interested, you step in the booth and you engage in the conversation. And the online environment jumped you right to step 3 immediately. And the salespeople were like, we're having to deal with these people who are like, oh my God, what happened? How did I get here? And like nobody thought that was fun. But like we have all these liminal spaces in the physical world that allow for different kinds of interaction. So what do we need to change about our virtual spaces to also kind of create these liminal stages of interaction, or figure out ways to have, like I've done lots of, workshops where nobody wants to turn their camera on. And I realize that's kind of a complaint that we hear from lots of, online facilitators. And I 100% get it, right? Like they want to eat their snacks while they're listening, and they don't want to have somebody watch them chewing. And it's exhausting to be face to face on camera all the time. But at the same time, it's one of these things where I, as a facilitator, am not getting anywhere near the feedback that I would if I was physically in the same room with these people. And so being able to judge what's working, and yeah, there's totally, things you can do about it. And the Insync folks are like the masters of this, right? Like they've figured out all of the ways to make these systems sing as best they can. But I still think we need really some different things in the systems to still help support that.
You've dug a lot into this. I want to close with one question, because I feel like upskilling is one of those topics in our industry that can feel overwhelming. I think that part of the reason for that is, a lot of times people, the upskilling conversations kind of focus on the endpoint. It focuses on look at all we've done with our upskilling program, with all the resources that we had, because we're this large organization and we're a mature learning culture. And that could feel really, really overwhelming for people, especially
Mhm.
who may not have all of those resources and those advantages. But I still want to start going in this direction. What are some small steps that people can do who might just be starting out around building upskilling into their practice and into their mindset to start going down this path?
Yeah, I think one of the things that a few just really simple tips. One of the things that I've started to do when I'm having conversations with stakeholders and subject matter experts is asking them how long did it take them to get good at something? So if we're teaching project managers how to do budget estimates, right, is to have the conversation with your subject matter expert and say, okay, how long did it take you to get good at this task? Right, because in their heads, this is easy because they've been doing it for years and they totally know it, and they don't understand why you want more than a 20-minute e-learning program to teach people how to do it because it's so obvious, right? But then if you actually kind of go back and go, okay, when you first started doing this, how long? And if they're actually remembering back in their own experience, they can say, "Oh, well, it probably was like, the first year I was really finding my feet on this topic." We're like, "Oh, okay, great, 12 months." So we can probably shorten that if we're much more deliberate about how we design the training. So let's maybe say 6 months. We'll cut it in half and aim for that, which is very arbitrary, but nonetheless. But now we're having a conversation about what's the 6-month path to somebody getting good at budget estimating, not the 20-minute e-learning on how to get good at budget estimating. And then the next question follow-up is, okay, well, what experiences did you have that really had it come together for you? And they say, well, I worked on this project and this project. And then, and I had to get like somebody to really look over my stuff, initially. And, oh, this was terrible. I had a bad experience where I totally underestimated it. And, I never made that mistake again. And then we can kind of say, all right, well, so you had a couple where somebody was coaching, so great, like, we can look at putting that into the into the 6-month period. We can have a coached period where somebody's kinda checking the stuff. And, okay, so bad experiences. Well, so, yeah, it would be great if not everybody had to have their own disastrous budgets to learn certain lessons, so maybe we can look at, like, so a war story setup where people will, like, open up budgets and talk about what well and what didn't well, and we can have several examples of those that kind of come up. And so if you can like help people kind of get out of the mindset of this is easy and we just need to tell people to actually remembering what their own kind of learning journey on some of these more difficult skills are, then we can kind of transform the with luck, and a lot of leading questions, we can hopefully kind of transform it into something that's a little bit more of a realistic journey of what's it actually going to take to get somebody to the point where they're proficient enough at this that they can kind of operate independently as needed. But that's probably my most practical is like, how long did it take you to get good at it? What experiences helped you learn how to do it? Okay, great. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing your fabulous insight on this. Let's now look at how do we put this into a little bit more of a structured learning experience for people.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect ending for the conversation we had. One of the reasons I love talking to you is like you always bring the science, you bring the strategy, you bring the techniques. But as you just said, the thing I appreciate most is you bring the practicality.
Yeah.
How to make all of this very real. It's not just some idea. You bring the practicality, and I've always appreciated that about the work that you and I really appreciate you taking the time to share that with us here on the podcast here today.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed our conversation here with Julie, I highly recommend, I can't recommend her books enough, Design for How People Learn and the follow-up Talk to the Elephant, Designing Learning for Behavior Change. Both are some of the best books in the industry. They're smart, they're accessible, and as we were just saying, they are endlessly practical, and I highly recommend them. And if you want to go deeper into how you can apply these skills in hybrid and virtual environments, I encourage you to join us for our July 24th webinar at 2 p.m. Eastern. It's a free webinar from Insync Training, where we'll continue conversations like this and talk about the real strategies for driving behavior change in a hybrid environment. You can save your spot now at insynctraining.com/webinar. A link to that will be in our show notes. And thanks again for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to Modern Learning on the Air for more insights on how leadership, learning, and performance intersect in the modern workplace. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning into Modern Learning on the Air. For all your training and services needs, visit us at insynctraining.com. And don't forget to sign up for our monthly webinars, where we cover key topics and trends in the learning and development space. Until next time, keep learning and keep growing.